Hello, my name is Jessie Jones, and I am the Coast Watch Volunteer Coordinator. Each year, Coast Watch partners with the Oregon Coast Management Program to bring you the Oregon King Tides Project, a special citizen science participation program encouraging coastal Oregonians to safely document with photography the highest tides of the year. Tonight's program, Optimizing the Ecosystem Services of U.S. Pacific Northwest Coastal Beaches and Dunes, is brought to you by Dr. Steve Dundas, Dr. Sally Hacker, and Dr. Peter Ruggiero. Again, my name is Jessie, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for the Coast Watch program of the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. Oregon Shores is a regional group that works to protect the environment of the entire coastal region, from the Columbia River to the California border, and from the crest of the coastal mountains to the edge of the continental shelf. In addition to organizing Coast Watch and citizen science, Oregon Shores tackles a wide range of conservation concerns, including land use planning, shoreline management, and marine conservation. Through Oregon Shores Coast Watch program, volunteers adopt 1-mile segments of the Oregon shoreline. Coast Watchers keep watch for a wide range of natural phenomena and human impacts. And we also organize a number of citizen science projects like the Oregon King Tide Project. We have high tide citizen science opportunities and low tide citizen science opportunities. New volunteers are always needed, so if you are not now a Coast Watcher, we hope you will consider adopting a mile. And now, this evening's program. We start with Meg Reed, who is a coastal management specialist and our co-coordinator with the Oregon King Tides Project. Thanks again for being here.
Great, thanks, Jessie. Good evening, everyone. My name is Meg Reed, and I'm the Coastal Shores Specialist for the Oregon Coastal Management Program, and also co-coordinator with Jessie and Coast Watch with the Oregon King Tides Project. And I'm gonna share my screen to show you our new website. This was developed over this past summer to try to be a little bit more user-friendly, mobile-friendly, photo-focused, and to make it easier for people to participate in this citizen science project. And so the king tides, if you don't know, they are the highest high tides of the year, and they're naturally occurring phenomenon when the sun, the moon, and the earth are all in alignment with each other, creating the greatest gravitational pull on the tides. And so we use this as a proxy to see what sea level rise impacts will look like now and into the future with the high water. So we ask people to go out and take photos of this high water and then submit them to our project so we can start to observe the impacts of it throughout the coast. So you can take pictures of the outer coast or up through the estuaries and rivers. So any of those areas that are tidally influenced are good places to take photos. So we have our new website, which is on the screen now at OregonKingTides.net. And this is the homepage. And so I just wanted to point out a few of the main details of the project so that all of you can submit your photos and participate. So if you scroll towards the middle of the page, there's participate, submit, and explore. So the easiest way to just get right to submitting your photos is to click submit. There's a little pop-up banner that talks about a photo contest. So we do have a photo contest going on right now for the 2020-2021 season in partnership with the Oregon Coast Visitors Association. And the winners will be decided in February. And first prize will get a $100 gift card to Amazon. And then there'll be prizes for second and third place as well. So that is just to let you know about the contest. And so then you'll see the photo form, and you can grant permission for our project to use your photo through the Creative Commons license, which just means we use it for educational purposes only. Permission for the contest, and then you have two options for uploading a photo depending on if you're out in the field or coming back after you've already taken your photos. So if you've already taken your photos and you're now uploading them after the fact, you do select image file. But if you are taking the photo out in the field, you can actually just click the camera icon and your camera will open automatically in the form. Then there's photo location. So you can do this a variety of ways, but I'm just going to type in Newport, Oregon, and it will zoom to that spot. And so then you can scroll through the map and decide exactly where you took your photo, and then just click it, and the point will automatically locate to that spot. And then you just put in the photo direction that you're facing when you took the photo, the date, that's really important. So whatever day you took the photo, and then anything that's in your photo. Is it showing erosion, flooding, public facilities, waves, reduced beach access, other things? And then a short caption. This is something that will go along when we're displaying the photo. So having some sort of descriptor of the location is really helpful. Like this is a picture of the Yaquina Bay State Park at the mouth of the Yaquina Bay Jetty. And then you can say this was taken during a king tide. There's other options because we also really like to have comparison shots during an average high tide so we can see the difference between the high water events. And then if you're also just happen to be out taking a picture during a storm event, it's not necessarily during a king tide, please feel free to submit those photos as well because they're also really informative and good photos for us to have. So you can just also click storm event. And then the other feature that is new this year is that you can actually add up to 10 photos per photo form. And so you can just click on the plus sign on the bottom and a whole new form will appear. And so you just go through the entire process again with picking a photo and putting in all the details. And then the last thing you do is put in your photo credit if you'd like to share your name or handle on social media, and then just click the submit button. I'm not going to do it right now, but you'll get a little thank you page that pops up, but if you want to do a separate form, you just have to hit the refresh button on the page, which will give you a new photo form. So hopefully that's pretty easy and handy. It is mobile friendly, so if you are taking photos on your phone, it should be pretty easy to do that. So the other thing I just wanted to mention is under the participate tab at the top, there's the option for a tide map. And so this shows the locations of all the tide stations in Oregon. And so if you click on any of them for the location that you're interested in taking photos, the tide information will pop up for the next king tide. And so all the highlighted predictions are the king tide events. So you can see on 12/15 of 2020, the high tide was at 8.4 feet for Netarts Bay. And then this tide station actually also gives you the average high tide for that location. So if you did want to go out and take a comparison photo, then you can look through the tide station for a day when it's about that height. So that's a pretty handy feature. There's also a map for priority locations if you need to get some inspiration for where to go take a picture. These are areas that have not had photos taken in a long time for our project. So it's pretty generic areas, but there are places that you could go check out. Like this is the Cape Mears, Tillamook Bay area. We haven't had a lot of photos in that place, in that location for a long time. So that's kind of the general gist of how to participate. But then if you want to look back at photos from past seasons, you can go to our photo gallery where we have many different photo galleries of comparison shots. So again, like I was saying, the average high tide compared with a king tide. Highlights, which is just sort of a collection of our favorites over the years. The current season is all the photos that have been submitted so far this year, and it also has a map with it, so you can see the locations that have been submitted already. Hazards is a collection of photos that show erosion or other types of hazards, flooding, and things like driftwood coming up into parking lots and things like that. The all-time one is actually just a map. It doesn't show the actual photos, but it's a map of every photo that has been submitted since 2010 that has a photo location associated with it. So we have, I think, over 3,000 photos now, so it's a pretty big collection. And then our collection of aerial imagery that has been submitted over the years in various locations. So that's a pretty cool place to look at photos as well. So that's kind of the gist of the new website. Hopefully you find it useful. You'll find all of the most up-to-date information about our project there. You can connect with us on social media as well. That is also available through the website. We're most active on Instagram and Facebook. But I would just make a plea that if you do want to participate and submit your photos, please do it through the photo form. If you submit your photos on social media, it's just really hard for us to keep track of those and to have all the right information associated with it. So the best way to make sure that your photo is put into our project for long-term monitoring is through that photo form that I shared earlier. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions. It doesn't look like there's anything so far, but if you do have questions about the King Tides or the King Tides project, please feel free to put them in the Q&A in the chat and we'll get to them when we can. But now I'd like to turn it over to our guest panelists. I'm very excited to introduce three professors from Oregon State University, Dr. Sally Hacker, Dr. Peter Ruggiero, and Dr. Stephen Dundas. And they are going to be talking about a collaborative project that they are working on to explore the beach and dune systems of Oregon and different impacts of climate and wave functions, beach grasses, and all sorts of things that have shaped these ecosystems and will continue to in the future. Dr. Sally Hacker is with the Department of Integrative Biology, Peter Ruggiero is with the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and Stephen Dundas is with the Department of Applied Economics. So I will turn it over to Sally to start us off. Thanks so much for being here.
Great, thank you, Meg and Jesse. And thank you all for being here. We're really happy to be here tonight. Typically, we've given these talks before, and typically we give them at a pub somewhere and have a glass of beer, but I don't think we'll be doing that until after the talk. So what we're going to do is do a team talk today. So I'm going to start out and talk about some background related to this project, our newest project that's funded by the Ecological Effects of Sea Level Rise program that's part of NOAA. And then Peter will come in and talk about some of the work that he's doing, and also Steve will take over at some point during the talk. So we're gonna sort of do a team talk relay with this presentation. Let's see here. There we go. So most of you probably know the beaches and dunes of the Pacific Northwest are pretty common habitat. Nearly 45% of our coastline is these sandy dune habitats. And we actually have the largest dune sheet in North America here in Oregon, down near Florence and Cape Blanco area. Prior to the 1900s, the dunes here in the Pacific Northwest were very sparsely vegetated, and they were very open, shifting sand environments. So there was a lot of moving sand in these environments, and a lot of sand covering infrastructure and towns and roads and so forth. So as a result of that, non-native beach grasses, so these are Ammophila species beach grasses, were systematically planted across the coast to stabilize the sand and create what really are called foredunes, or these large hills of sand that you typically see along the shoreline. And so most of our coast that has sandy beaches now is also dune backed, so it has these foredunes in the background. Here's a picture to give you an idea of how much has changed with the planting of these beach grasses. Here's a before and after photo, if you will, of Pacific City, Oregon in the 1930s, and then 80 years later in 2012. And you can see that in 1930, there was a lot of open sand. There wasn't very much development along the coast. The sand was shifting, moving around the coast pretty freely. And then once the grasses were planted, that stabilized that system, created these foredunes, as you can see there. And also a lot of development followed along because of the stabilizing nature of planting these grasses. So these grasses are really kind of large scale landscape level ecosystem engineers, if you will, creating these foredune habitats. And they provide a number of important ecosystem services, and this is part of our project, is to start to value these ecosystem services and get an idea of the relative importance and relative contribution of these ecosystem services in different areas of the coast. One of the most important ones is coastal protection. We know that these foredunes serve as barriers from extreme storms, sea level rise, tsunamis, etc. It can also prevent beach erosion compared to the alternative gray infrastructure. For example, if you were to put in seawalls or riprap and so forth, that gray infrastructure is can promote beach erosion, and foredunes do not do that. And then finally, they can capture and stabilize blowing sand. So that blowing sand can damage infrastructure, and by capturing that sand, you can reduce the infrastructure impacts. Another really important ecosystem engineer that we're considering in our project is recreation and tourism. We know that beaches and dunes are really important in terms of kind of the economic value of recreation. We know that 70% of US tourists visit beaches, and about 85% of all the US vacation dollars are spent on areas that have beaches and dunes. So they have a huge economic impact for coastal communities. We also know that they're aesthetically pleasing places to go. That's why people like to recreate there. So there's aesthetics is one really important ecosystem service. View sheds can be valued, and Steve will talk a bit about this in a while. And there are also spiritual and cultural values that you may not be able to put economic numbers on, but obviously are really important for coastal communities. Biodiversity conservation is another ecosystem engineer that we're considering in our study. This includes native species that live on these habitats. And here in the Pacific Northwest, and in particular in Oregon and Southern Washington, there's an Endangered Species Act listed Western snowy plover. So this is a rare bird species that is protected under the ESA. And finally, a sort of new ecosystem engineer, if you will, or ecosystem service, excuse me, if you will, is carbon storage. And so that's one of we know that dunes can store carbon both in the vegetation and also in the sand of the dune. And given how much sand is out there and how much vegetation is out there, dunes may provide actually quite a bit of carbon storage services to humans, so absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. And there are very few studies on carbon storage in dunes worldwide. There are basically no studies here in the Pacific Northwest. And so part of our project is to measure the amount of carbon that is being stored in these dunes to try to get an idea of whether or not they could be an important player in terms of what we think about as blue carbon or ocean carbon. But there are also trade-offs in ecosystem services. For example, if we restore a dune for restoration purposes for, let's say, western snowy plover or rare plants, that restoration involves removing grasses and grading dunes. And so that can potentially be a trade-off with coastal protection and carbon storage if we were to remove the vegetation from those systems. So there are trade-offs. Another trade-off could be grading dunes for view sheds, so taking dunes down so that views are better. But that could also be traded off with coastal protection, because if we grade those dunes, now the dunes are less protective from sea level rise and storms, et cetera. Another trade-off that we're looking at is the trade-off between beach accessibility and gray infrastructure. So gray infrastructure that's being placed for coastal protective purposes, such as what you see here with this seawall or this riprap, that structure can decrease beach accessibility, and Peter will talk about that in a minute. So there are these trade-offs that we see in the system, and the role or the trade-offs make us want to really focus on coastal planning and how we can optimize all the services that these habitats provide under sea level rise and extreme storms, given these trade-offs that we see. And so our project really considers these trade-offs and considers how we can plan around optimizing these ecosystem services. So Peter will take over and talk more about the project and the objectives.
Great, thank you very much, Sally, and thank you all for being here. So as it's been mentioned, we have this project. We're about a year into a 3-year project funded by the National Centers for Coastal and Ocean Science, part of NOAA. And this is the Ecological Effects of Sea Level Rise program within that program. The project has 2 fundamental objectives. The first of which, Sally's mentioned these 5 very important ecosystem services provided by beaches and dunes. And so the first thing that needs to be done is we need to actually try to value those. And we're going to do that via a variety of biophysical and economic approaches. And this is one of the first studies that's really tried to tackle that with a suite of ecosystems. And then second, getting more at the trade-offs that Sally was just alluding to, we then want to integrate that kind of biophysical and economic data that we're using to do the valuation into a couple of different land use models that we're actually going to be using to explore these trade-offs and explore different management opportunities. And basically, we're thinking about co-developing with a variety of different coastal communities of various optimal policy scenarios that do optimize these ecosystem services and reduce the negative parts of the trade-offs that we've been talking about. And one of the buzzwords that's used in our field these days is climate resilient adaptation pathways. And if we can develop management outcomes or policy scenarios that get us towards those climate resilient adaptation pathways, we'll be doing a good job. So next slide, Sally. The remainder of the talk will really be kind of diving a little bit deeper into those 2 objectives. And so, as I said, first and foremost, we need to determine the value of this suite of ecosystem services. And so on this slide, we're kind of restating those 5 ecosystem services: coastal protection, recreation, beach accessibility, biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, and then the view sheds or aesthetics, as Sally put it. And there's a whole variety, and I'm not going to read these right here, but there's a whole variety of approaches for valuation. And some of these are going to be looking from a biophysical perspective, and some of these will be taking more of an econometric perspective. I'm going to give you a couple of examples on the biophysical side in the next few slides, and then Steve's going to chime in and kind of give us some examples of how we're doing this from an econometric perspective. So I think next slide, Sally. So great. So in order to estimate some of the biophysical values of things like coastal protection or beach accessibility, there's a variety of metrics that we could actually try to compute along the coastline. And so we're going to call these resilience metrics. So for example, if we're thinking about the role of beaches and dunes in terms of limiting coastal flooding into the back shore, we might be interested in the elevation of the crest of a dune and how often water levels are able to overcome that. So obviously with the king tide cycle coming up next week, if we are unfortunately hit with a extreme storm at the same time, like we were, I think, last January around this kind of same cycle of king tides, we might have the opportunity where we're having overtopping of dunes. And so if we're interested in the frequency with which certain areas of coastlines are being overtopped, we need an ability to be able to predict that. And so one of the things that we're doing with this project is bringing a probabilistic total water level model that's been developed by our research groups over the last several years to bear on this problem of developing a resilience metric as just an example. So this not only will tell us how often certain areas might be impacted by flooding, it might give us some idea of how often areas might be eroded. It also is going to be able to allow us to compute how often beaches might be accessible. And that might differ if a beach is backed by a seawall versus a beach backed by a natural sand dune. And so one of the things that this approach does is it combines things like sea level rise scenarios. So we're looking at kind of long-term forecasts of these processes, as well as the astronomical tides. So it will account for things like the king tide cycles that are coming up next week. But it also takes into account the variety of other processes that cause extreme water levels along our coast. And those can be operating at interannual variability. So right now we're in a La Nina season, but if we were in a major El Nino, we would have sea level anomalies that would cause potentially higher water levels along our coast, seasonal variability, and both intra-seasonal and daily weather patterns in terms of storm events that cause high water levels along our coast. And with this tool, we're able to generate both historical as well as future time series of how high the water level gets on the coastline. So next slide, Sally. Thanks. Now, I'm not sure if the video on the lower left works. Did you, can you click that? Yeah, great. So that's actually a typo. This is a video that Jay Senewald took in Sillet Spit a few years ago during a previous king tide event. But it's a little bit washed out. But I think you can see that this is an event where water levels are exceeding the toe and the crest of the dunes and starting to impact infrastructure in a negative way. And so this is just an example of how often do extreme total water levels exceed a relevant elevation threshold. Well, if we just are thinking about sea level rise only, that gives us kind of the elevation or the water level elevation in a mean sense. But if you click one more slide, Sally, it should have a forecast now going into the future of not just where the mean sea level is, but also all these other components that go into the total water level. So for example, in this case, maybe the elevation of the toe of the foredune might be somewhere around 4.5 to 5 meters. And you can see in the present day, that might be impacted about once a month or so by some high water level events. But into the future with this kind of approach, we can see that it may be with certain sea level rise scenarios, it might be impacted virtually every high tide cycle. The crest of the dune is probably somewhere along the lines of about 5.5 to 6 meters in this example. And right now, in the present day, that might only get impacted during king tides and coincident high storm events. So maybe not even once every year, once every couple of years. But with this approach, we could actually quantify into the future the possibility that this kind of event where this infrastructure would be in jeopardy with coastal flooding, this might happen several times a year. So these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about, and the relative role of dunes versus different kinds of management practices on the coast. All right, next slide, Sally, thanks. Another kind of biophysical value that we're quantifying in terms of coastal protection, beach accessibility, it's just basically the general retreat and/or recovery of the coastline over time. And so one of the things that we care about in terms of resilience metric would be how often are we experiencing erosion. And so what we're doing with this part of the project is we're quantifying coastal change. And so this is about a decade-old product, but we're updating historical shoreline change rates, and we're actually also generating with that approach where we're quantifying future total water levels. We're going to also be developing some predictions of potentially where the coastline might go in the future. This is an example from the Tulma County coastline. Basically, everything to the right-hand side of that vertical black line shows areas that have been eroding over the last couple of decades. And so the vast majority of the Tulma County shoreline has been experiencing erosion, but you do see that some areas have been experiencing progradation, such as Pacific City, Oregon. And so we do know that in terms of areas that have been experiencing progradation, kind of the management demand has been in terms of things like beach grading, dune grading for aesthetics, like the top right photograph. And then in areas like the southern end of Tulma County, Neskowin, that have been eroding, like Sally mentioned, we have the demand for riprap revetments being kind of a management response. And so in thinking about in terms of the entire county or a larger stretch of coast along the coastline, we're trying to think about what these different coastal change patterns, at least historically, as well as going into the future, might have in terms of coastal management demands. Next slide, please. All right, just one more example from a biophysical perspective. So if we're interested in estimating the biophysical value of a biodiversity ecosystem service, in this case, potentially the number of western snowy plovers, as Sally mentioned, a threatened species, or rare plants, we can actually look to data sets like which are shown in the middle of this panel. And they're basically showing things like counts of nests and the number of adult birds of snowy plovers. And basically this kind of information is showing, and this was collected by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Service, or actually the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, basically showing that after the projects like habitat restoration areas are performed along the coastline, the birds recover in a positive way. And so we can again use this kind of information along with some of these other resilience metrics to determine appropriate management actions along the coastline. So I think that's the last biophysical example, and maybe we'll move to Steve's part of this.
Great, thank you, Peter. And thank you all for watching tonight. I think I'll start off by saying it's important to recognize that as we're talking about these management choices and these ecosystem service values, is that different places along the coast are going to require different management strategies and provide a different set of services. So in order for us to be able to tease those differences out and understand what an undeveloped beach might need versus what a developed beach might need, we need to understand how Oregonians and people that live in these communities and recreate in these communities, how they value the different service flows that are offered by coastal beaches and dunes. And in order to do this, we need to do a little bit of detective work. So traditional economic analysis says, okay, we can observe people buying a certain quantity of a certain good at a certain price, and we can therefore determine its value. Well, when we talk about ecosystem services, that quantity and that price are harder to quantify. As Peter mentioned, the biophysical side, those are kind of the quantity metrics of how these services might change and provide services that people value. Whereas prices is where I come in. And in this sense, the environment does not have you can't go to a convenience store and purchase environmental quality or an ecosystem service. We need to investigate this and look at it from a perspective of what behavior can we observe that people make, what choices can we observe that people make that can reveal their preferences for these different ecosystem services. And when such data on observed behavior doesn't exist, we need to design hypothetical surveys that put people in the decision-making seat of, if this was a choice that you had to make, which choice would you support and how much are you willing to pay for these different set of ecosystem services that might be provided by different management choices. So we're coming at this two ways. We're looking at kind of revealed behavior. And the way we can do this in coastal areas is through housing markets. So people reveal a lot about themselves and their preferences by the choices of where they choose to locate and how much they are willing to pay for homes in that specific location. And each home comes with a bundle of ecosystem services attached to it. Not just how many bedrooms does it have, not just what school district it's in, but the natural amenities of the neighborhood and the surrounding area also play a large role in determining the price of that housing unit. So we can use observations of lots of housing transactions and statistical tools to then tease out what housing market decisions can reveal about people's preferences for these different ecosystem services. Next slide, Sally. Thank you. So I talked a little bit about housing markets, but on the other side, when we don't have kind of these big ticket items, observed behavior that we can use to reveal people's preferences, we need people to state their preferences through answering survey questions that are specifically designed to elicit their preferences and values for the different services that occur. Previous work that Sally, Peter, and I have done together have led to the development of two separate surveys that are going to be critical inputs to our kind of goal of looking at how do we optimize the management of Oregon's coastline and beaches and dunes. The first survey was completed well, not last year anymore, 2 years ago in early 2019, and the focus was on dune restoration. So as Sally noted earlier, lots of the dunes that we see in Oregon have non-native beach grasses that create these tall foredunes. This has effects on native plants and birds in a way that it crowds out their space for open sand. So our motivation here was, if we think about dune restoration, if we pose a question of dune restoration to the general public, based on some work that is going on in the U.S. Forest Service down on the coastal dune sheet near Florence. So this survey is about undeveloped shorelines and what can we do to change the structure of the dune system to change the provision of services. So we provided our respondents with illustrations because pictures of how dunes looked prior to the introduction of these grasses were hard to come by. So we used an illustrator to help us try to convey what these changes would look like from different vantage points along the coast. We sent the survey out to 4,200 households in the Pacific Northwest, and we got a pretty decent response rate for a mail survey of 28%. So we had almost 1,200 people respond. And we asked questions based on different restoration scenarios that could occur on Oregon dunes. And importantly, what we did find is that the overall, the people in the residents of the Pacific Northwest would have an annual aggregate willingness to pay to moderately restore a coastal dune. And that's moving from the top picture in the slide to the bottom, which is removing the grasses, grading the dunes, and providing more habitat for species like the western snowy plover, of around between $1,700 to $11,000 per acre. So this provides us evidence that this type of restoration would be valued by society, and that we can put an approximate value on how people would respond to this type of program. Next slide, Sally, please. And then, so we asked about moderate restoration, and then we also asked about full restoration, which included removing the invasive grasses, grading the dunes, but also actively propagating native plants and vegetation, some that are also listed on the Endangered Species Act. The willingness to pay for fully restoring coastal dunes was between $6,500 and $36,000 per acre. We also asked questions about changes in recreation behavior, and interestingly enough, Oregonians do not want their recreation access changed whatsoever. So the highest values were for doing the restoration, but not changing any recreation access, because we also asked questions about allowing more access through motorized vehicles like ATVs, and we also asked about less access, and that would arise from having to close some of these restored areas when there was endangered species nesting. But nobody really liked that idea in the survey, and they expressed clear preferences to actually do some of this restoration as long as it didn't affect recreation or other services. Next slide, please. The second survey that I'm helping design here is currently in the works. It's currently in draft form, and we're working with some stakeholders now to make sure that we're capturing the ideas and be understandable to the general public that might receive it. And the intention is for it to go to the field in late this summer. And the goal is to estimate both recreational use values for people that visit Oregon beaches often and those that maybe only visit sometimes. So understanding the values that they derive from using the beaches and how those values might change with different management strategies, particularly armoring policies on developed shorelines. So the first survey went after restoration and recreation on undeveloped shorelines, and this one will focus more on developed shorelines. We're also toying with a modeling strategy to try to also get at non-use values associated with beach access. These would be things like existence or bequest values that someone in Eastern Oregon just might want the beaches around to be accessible to their grandchildren, so they would value management strategies that would keep it accessible now and in the future. So there's a number of different values, economic values, that we'd be looking to assess with this second survey effort. Next slide, please. And the second strategy that we'll be using is looking more, having existing data kind of reveal to us people's preferences. And we, as I mentioned before, we can do that through looking at transactions in housing markets over time. Previously, I've worked on a paper with a colleague here and a former grad student looking at coastal land use policy goal 18, which governs who can and cannot armor and where armoring can occur along developed shorelines. We wanted to look at having the option versus not having the option to better understand how people might value that, not only the structure itself, but the option to be able to protect your home in the future. So we took over about 15 years of oceanfront transactions to see how values for houses were affected by this eligibility for having this armoring structure. What we did find is that on average, there was no effect for the average home in the sample, but realized that that was an artifact of the fact that our average home in the sample was about 35 feet above sea level and on an accreting shoreline, which means it was gaining sand over the short term. When we turned our focus towards homes that were on lower elevation or on eroding shorelines, we did find that homes, all else equal, two homes that are relatively similar, one is eligible for armoring and one is not. The one that was armoring, was eligible, would sell for 22% more than the one that was not. So this gives us a way to think about how future armoring patterns might change coastal housing markets, which is a value for coastal protection. We also found interestingly that there were spillover effects, that if I was buying a property that was ineligible for armoring that was next to someone that was eligible, I would sell for about 8% less relative to another parcel that was ineligible but not nearby someone that had the option to do the armoring in the future, suggesting people might be worried about kind of spillover effects or deflected wave action. And the picture you see here is kind of our estimates from this model applied to a certain set of homes on the coastline. The green ones are the ones that are eligible and reflect the premium from that eligibility, whereas the red ones are ineligible, and the numbers there reflect kind of the penalty, so to speak, in housing prices that would arise from their ineligibility and proximity to those that could armor their property. So this will give us a way to track values for coastal protection from coastal homeowners through different scenarios of future sea level rise. Next slide, please. And lastly, the plan for right now is in Tulma County to run a whole new suite of different housing market models to see how these transactions can reveal how people are trading off values for viewshed. Do they have an uninterrupted view of the ocean? Can they see a lighthouse? Can they see a sea stack? Beach accessibility and other geomorphological factors, like are they on a dune-backed beach or a bluff-backed beach? And we can try to identify values that people place for the ecosystem services that are provided by the housing. We can also attempt to value these services under a different set of risk scenarios. Okay, next slide. I think that's all for me, and I think it's going back to Peter. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve. All right, so we're we're now shift gears a little bit to the second objective of the project. So we just spent time giving examples of how we're trying to value the suite of ecosystem services provided by beaches and dunes. And now the idea is to integrate a lot of this information into land use models and, kind of getting at this overarching goal, fairly optimistic goal of optimizing coastal ecosystem services of beaches and dunes. And so we're going to be doing this via land use planning model, or a couple of which I'll talk about one. I'll talk about a model that we've used for a variety of projects already along the Oregon coast that's referred to as Envision. And basically, we have the suite of ecosystem services. We just talked about these approaches for valuation. We also know that we have projections of sea level rise, while still very uncertain. We know that we're having accelerated sea level rise, and we have a suite of probabilistic sea level rise scenarios provided to us via a variety of communities that we're going to be using as potential scenarios going forward. The other thing we need to be thinking about this is a range of different policy options. And I see in the chat, some people are already getting at a range of, or suggesting a range of possible policies that can be implemented along the coast. We've kind of referred to this goal 18, or the ability to armor a coastline to protect the infrastructure from further erosion. Obviously, that's one option. Actually, Sally, go to the next slide, please. Thanks. And on the left-hand side now, this is just basically giving some kind of overarching philosophies of a couple of different ways of potentially managing coastlines. One kind of philosophy is to have a suite of policies that are protecting infrastructure, and that's done by, traditionally via these riprap revetments or beach nourishment programs in other parts of the country. Another kind of end member approach to managing a stretch of coastline would be either realign. A lot of people refer to this as manage retreat, and that's starting to become something that's a little bit more palatable because of the current sea level rise and storminess patterns that people are experiencing, plus projections of things potentially getting worse. And so these are just a couple of different options, but there's a whole suite of different policies that could be packaged in a variety of different scenarios. And we want to explore this range of different options. And we're going to do that by combining the valuations that we just talked about with the climate change scenarios and a suite of policy scenarios. So I think maybe go to the next slide. So this is just an attempt at kind of explaining a little bit more about what I'm trying to say here. I do want to say that we have spent in previous projects a lot of time working with the various different stakeholders. We've done this on the Oregon coast as well as the Washington coast, thinking through what this potential range of policies could be. So we have, again, protect policies, manage realignment policies, restoration policies geared at increasing certain ecosystem services associated with biodiversity. So there's a whole suite that kind of goes into these scenarios. That on the lower left-hand side of the middle part of the panel where it says policy scenario narratives, that green box, there's a whole bunch of different ideas that we've already been generated. But we're going to continue to have those conversations and try to explore a range of different things. But basically what this approach does, this land use kind of planning model called Envision, allows us to do is to combine a range of climate impact change scenarios. So sea level rise, potential changes in storminess. So I think most of us along the Oregon coast know that El Niños really dictate when we have really significant storm seasons with high water levels. So there's some projections out there that say that the frequency of major El Niños might change into the future. Maybe that'll get larger or less frequent. And also a variety of different sea level rise scenarios, as I mentioned before. We want to combine that with these policy scenario narratives that are being co-produced with a variety of different stakeholder groups along the coast, as well as a variety of landscape change models. And I talked about some of them before, the total water level model, the coastal change model. And basically we're going to use this model, this Envision model, to quantify a whole bunch of different metrics. So we've just talked about a few of them here, but we're going to be looking at a bunch of them. Okay, so this is a way to integrate a lot of the things that we've talked about thus far. And so, Sally, next slide, please. So one of the things that Sally focused on at the beginning of the talk was the fact that while beaches and dunes do provide a variety of of ecosystem services, there's actually trade-offs in terms of how we might manage the coastline. And so we might manage for one of those ecosystem services, but that we might see a decline in some of the other ones. And so by doing this valuation and using a land use planning tool that's spatially explicit, allows us to at least start to assess these trade-offs and to actually think about what we actually want the future of the coastline to look like. And so just as a caveat, I mentioned earlier, we're basically just in the first year of a 3-year project. And so these are just very initial results from some of the previous work we've done. But basically what this Envision model allows us to do is to quantify with existing policies or potentially changes in policies, how the coastline might evolve into the future. And so on the left-hand side is basically simply a time series of the percent of the Rockaway beach section of Tulma County, the percent of shoreline that is armored under a couple of different policy scenarios, and basically going from the relative present out into the future. And this is an area that is fairly developed. It has a lot of homes that are eligible for Goal 18, eligible to armor themselves. And under a status quo scenario or even a protect scenario, quite a bit of the coastline might actually be armored going forward into the future, which is reducing the impact, the negative impact, if you're interested in protecting infrastructure. It reduces the flooding that those coastline, that infrastructure might be experiencing. It might influence positively the lack of erosion that infrastructure is experiencing. It might save some money, et cetera. On the other hand, if you're interested in the recreational services of the beach, and by that one metric that we're quantifying is the accessibility of the beach. And so on the right-hand side is a time series of how the beach accessibility of this coastline might change through time as well. And so we basically see a reduction of beach accessibility in these scenarios in which we're actually increasing the armoring. And basically, you know, there's a lot of different ways to quantify beach accessibility. And basically what we've done here is basically simply quantified in any given day in which the highest water of the day, the maximum total water level, that is impacting the base of the foredune or the base of the coastal protection structure that might be fronting some infrastructure. If that happens, then that's an inaccessible day. And we quantify a certain percentage of that time per year where we have an inaccessible beach. That's going to be shown here in this time series. The other thing I'll point out is that, well, these time series show differences in policy scenarios, basically the different colors. The bands of variability, the differences between the low end of the pink and the high end of the pink of these different time series are basically the differences between a relatively low climate change scenario, so basically modest sea level rise going forward, to a relatively high range of sea level rise. And so we can also quantify not only the influence of these different policies on these metrics that we might care about, but also the influence of a variety of different climate change impacts along the coastline. Next slide. So this might be a slightly easier way to kind of visualize something very similar. So again, we're kind of looking down at one stretch of the Oregon coast, starting on the left-hand side of this panel. We see the stretches of coasts with that kind of orangish color that is highlighted. Those are the areas that basically in around 2010 were already armored with riprap revetments. But if we keep our existing status quo policies going forward, and we know we have sea level rise and other climate change impacts, we think that a lot of these residents might go forward and actually armor the coastline. And we see that percentage of shoreline is actually increasing. So basically showing the same thing that we showed in the time series panels before, but just in a much more visual manner. And then on the right-hand side, basically again, showing the trade-offs of that, looking at the decrease in beach accessibility through time. And in this case, plotting that out to the end of the century and looking at the present day, end of the century under status quo policies, but also under a scenario where what we call realign, but other people might call it manage retreat. We can actually see that different management policies might change this trade-off that we're trying to quantify. So as I mentioned, these are relatively early results, but this is one of the things that we're going to be pushed forward with the rest of the project. Next slide, Sally. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of the things that we want to present. I did want to thank and identify that we have several graduate students from our various departments working on these projects and providing some of the data and evaluations that we've been talking about, and a whole suite of partners from various groups along the Oregon coast that we've worked with historically, as well as we're going to continue to work with as the project goes on. And so I think with that, I will stop and we can open it up for questions.